Is that kosher?
I think so. In the larger scheme of things, right, it's my pleasure. So it's very, very nice to be with you again. I was asked to study with you these 2 weeks the book of Isaiah, and I chose as a title instead the book of Isaiahs. And this first week together, we'll talk about what I mean by that. And then next week, I look forward to studying a particular passage, one that will be, I think, quite familiar to many of us from the book. But I hope by the time we get to that passage, we'll be able to contextualize it perhaps in new and useful ways. One could say that Isaiah, in the Hebrew Bible, as we have it today, is testimony to the premise that the prophecy one finds in Hebrew Bible wasn't essentially a literary enterprise. The prophecy wasn't intended for books, at least not books as we know them. The apparent bookness of the book of Isaiah is misleading, and that's what I want to talk about this morning in particular. But on the contrary, what we have as content in this book was not intended, nor for the most part was anything associated with Hebrew Bible, Old Testament prophecy, intended to meet commonly held expectations about proper structure, or development of themes, or even clear coherence, which we commonly associate with what makes a book a book. That a book isn't simply defined by its physical character, by the fact that it's the stuff inside covers, but that in fact there is some kind of overall structure, that there's some kind of organizational development from beginning to end, that there's some coherent nature to the whole. Isaiah, in fact, puts all of that to the test. Yechezkel Kaufman, a very highly regarded, influential, mid-20th century biblical scholar, said regarding the composition of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is generally regarded as the most composite and disordered of all of the prophetic books. Its composition and revision are held to have extended through generations of disciples and later prophetic writers down to the time, some think, even of the Hasmoneans. As we'll see, that would mean that this was a book that was composed by various hands over about 800 years. He goes on to say not only that, but none of the great historical changes that the Near East underwent during the 7th and 6th centuries are reflected in the first part of the book, which ostensibly dates from that period. That there is a kind of studied historicity to the book. That it seems that this is replete with prophecies that didn't happen, and yet remain in the text as we have it. And that instead, this is a perfect example, an artifact of the sporadic, unpolished nature of biblical prophecy. That this disorder, that this apparent incoherence of what looks today to be, from page to page, some kind of literary whole, in fact expresses something deeper about what Hebrew Bible prophecy was about. That prophetic books aren't books at all, but collections of disparate moments of inspiration with discontinuities left unresolved and unhomogenized. and that a uniform, methodical structure for what purported to be remnants of divine inspiration would actually suggest a fraud. That if this hung together too well, if it seemed too coherent, if the organizational structure that brought this material together was too obvious and too effective, it would, perhaps, to the ancient compilers of this material, have signaled there's something phony about this. That the disorganization, that the sporadic nature of this collection of visions and prophecies is in fact, in a very important way, testimony to its authenticity. Now, all of that can be accurate enough, and yet the fact remains that the book we have is a copy editor's nightmare. At a certain point in the historical development of the transmission of these oracles, prophecies, and visions and the like, there was a decision made that it should be transmitted as a unit. And it's a really odd and troubling unit. Jumbled and juxtaposed passages, clearly composed over several centuries, if not 7 or 8, at least 2 or 3, reflecting changing historical contexts and perspectives. And let me suggest an analogy here that might be closer to home. So what I've started with, once again, is this. We're talking about something that we casually refer to as a book, but a collection of words that in no way conforms to what we usually expect of a book. A collection of material that seems to be insensitive to the degree to which it contains contradictions and odd, jagged juxtapositions. Something like the Constitution. Let me say, we were a couple thousand years removed from the composition of the United States Constitution, with its layered tradition of original text, with articles composed and arranged not necessarily in the only possible logical order, overlaid with 10 amendments, 10 changes, which somehow take on their own literary character, are immediately juxtaposed to the original text, are amendments, but we usually think, no, there are those amendments, and then there are other amendments, but somehow we call it all Constitution, and then subsequent amendments with no really organizational structure behind them. You can go from Amendment 13 to Amendment 14 and 15, see some continuity, and then lose it when you get to 16, 17, and 18. You'd have to know something about the historical development of those amendments to get any sense of why they're in the order that they're in. You could print the Constitution in such a way as to leave someone unfamiliar with its history totally baffled as to why you would call this a single unitary document. Something like the book of Isaiah. In fact, if we think about it now, that jumbled nature of the Constitution, in fact, is testimony to its authenticity. That it is an evolving expression of real moments, somewhat disparate and somewhat contradictory moments of composition, of development. We somehow imagine that it all belongs together. We call it a single document. We do the same with Isaiah. Layers that become the document, but oddly juxtaposed if one's expecting a book per se. Which means that I think it'd be wise for us to begin with this. Is this, in any sense, what you and I then would recognize as a book at all? Are we fair to ourselves when we call Isaiah a book today, knowing what I've just suggested? It would seem, in fact, that all of the Hebrew Bible, more or less, from beginning to end, is composed of composites. It's just that Isaiah is more striking this. That this is characteristic of all of Hebrew Bible, that it's layered historically and in terms of somewhat disparate perspectives. To use a geological image, biblical books tend to be made up of sedimentary rather than igneous text. The biblical myth is that there was this moment of extreme divine heat that fused the text in a single coherent whole. What we're looking at is layer upon layer of slow sediment of inspiration, some here and some there, some then and some then. And as thoughtful commentators, aware of this tendency, yet deeply engaged by the resulting complexities, that in fact this complexity adds to the texture and character of what we're looking for in Bible, as thoughtful commentators have observed, ancient Israelites and their Jewish heirs were no doubt aware of this as well. One of the intriguing things about this, and this has to do, I think, with 19th century scholarly presumptuousness, is look what we discovered, as if to conclude that nobody noticed this for a few thousand years. That an ancient Israelite, once this text came to be collected the way it is, or a Jew of the 1st or 2nd centuries, would somehow miss what I've described. I think, on the contrary, that kind of 19th and early 20th century scholarly assumption, look what we've found, that this is a jumble of juxtaposed and ill-fitted pieces. What, in fact, we can more cogently assume is that readers have, for a long time, observed these same characteristics, and yet treated these composites as whole texts nevertheless. That is to say, ancient readers looked at the same collection of texts we're looking at now and said, I understand why they belong together nevertheless. And so the wiser question for us isn't how did they miss it all along, but rather, what did others before us perhaps see or assume about what they were finding in Isaiah that made the text work for them nevertheless? How can we recover that sensibility? If not because ultimately we prefer it, at least because it helps us to understand how this text came to be. That is to say, we may be hampered, first of all, by relatively narrow assumptions about what a book should or shouldn't be. Now, we're, of course, familiar with anthologies and collections and the like. But as we're about to see, the book of Isaiah is more than an anthology. Let me give just one more analogy in this regard. If not the Constitution, that's kind of highfalutin. How about a classic blues song? You root it in a point of departure from the outset in an original voice, but then the voices who take it up, who take up the tune, move it here and there along the way. And with that in mind, about 100 years ago, Martin Buber composed a short piece on why he saw the book of Isaiah as a literary unit. What it was about this book that constituted a whole and not just a bag of pieces. And this morning I want to dwell for a few minutes on what Buber's theory proposes and then explore its implications with you. He composed a short piece entitled The Book of Isaiah, a unit, How So?, in which he suggests that there's a decisive link between the most obvious disparate portions of Isaiah. And that is to say, it's commonly said that the first 40 chapters of the book of Isaiah are obviously from somewhere else and someone's else than the last 26. Sometimes people say the first 33, and then the middle 7, and then the final 26. There are all kinds of ways of organizing the pieces. But from the beginning of the book to the end, you've obviously, because of historical references, traveled at least a couple hundred years. So Buber says, how do you call it a single book and give it the name Isaiah, if at least from beginning to end, it looks like we're in two different historical settings, at least a couple of hundred years apart? Let me show you how. That's what Buber's essay proposes. First, Isaiah ben Amoz, the name that appears at the outset of the book. From the introductory passage, appears to have lived in the late 8th century before the Common Era. That is from around 750, say, to 700 before the Common Era, BC. While the later chapters included are voices of people who appear, as I said a moment ago, 1, 2, 3, maybe more, to have lived in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, right around the time of the Babylonian exile. And in taking up this challenge of making sense of what these voices are doing together in a single collection called Isaiah, Buber reminds us to think again about what we might likely assume when we hear something described as a book. He begins with a usage that's found only in Isaiah, and this is one of Buber's more interesting techniques. He was really good with lexicons and usage of terminology. So, it turns out that there's a word that's a Hebrew word that is only used as a noun in the book of Isaiah. But it's used at the beginning and toward the end of the book. So let me say that again. Buber says, I can show you a word. It's used as an adjective elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, but it's only used as a word in Isaiah. And I wouldn't have much to show you, he said, if it was only used at the beginning of Isaiah or at the end of Isaiah, because then that would say, if it were in one of those parts of the book, so there was a particular author who had a particular tendency to use this particular way, this particular word, in an idiosyncratic way. But Buber says no. It looks like this is a word that is only used this way in the book of Isaiah, but it seems to be used in this peculiar way by two different voices, separated by 200 years, but only in this book. So what might that mean? The word, that Buber has in mind is the Hebrew limud. Limud. Limud comes from a root that means to train, or to teach, or even to guide against someone's will. I can tell you that it looks like in its most basic form, it refers to herding techniques. Now, that doesn't say much about ancient notions of education. But this letter in Hebrew is lamed. That letter in ancient pictographic early Hebrew looked like this, and it was a picture of a shepherd's staff. It was the stick that a shepherd used to swat the butt of the animal to make sure it went in the right direction. That's how you get that letter. But it just so happens that the first letter of limud is from the same root as the word itself. The word means, in its most basic form, to do that. And then it kind of grows and gets domesticated and more sophisticated, and it comes to mean teaching, and educating, and training, and the like. That full range of meaning, including a custom, something that one becomes habituated to. In the book of Jeremiah, you find the word used as an adjective. In a couple cases, people are described as being habituated, trained in a certain sort of way. People and animals as an adjective. But it's only used as a noun in Isaiah to mean a disciple or a student. And the word appears for the first time in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 15. So let's look at that passage. As we turn to it, are there any questions or comments so far? This issue of we really have to give the kind of complicated conglomeration quality of the book of Isaiah its due. We can't impose a structure on it for a couple reasons. One, because it might deny it the authentic character of biblical momentary inspiration. Plus, that structure might simply distract us from the very real textures that are what the book is about. Any questions? Yes, please.
You understood the meaning of the shepherd's staff.
Yes.
Because the sheep follow the shepherd, they don't herd.
The larger animals, like oxen, you would have to follow and push ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sheep don't.
Sheep, less likely, that's right. Sheep would less likely need somebody to push them around. At least, not generally speaking, in a flock. Yes. Herders of various sorts. Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
You haven't suggested yet that the unity of the book is the unity of a school of thought.
Yes.
That there was actual transmission from one generation to another of the inspiration of the original prophet through his disciples.
Exactly. And that's where Buber's going to take us.
All right.
That's right. Exactly. So let's look at this first passage, 8:15. Sur Tuda Chatom Torah Bimludai. Tie up the testimony and seal the teaching among my limudai, among my disciples. And this, Buber says, is the first time you get this particular form of that root as a noun. This is the first time disciples, students, followers, or the like are described with this word. The prophet suggests that what he has to offer is at the wrong time. And therefore, what I've said should be bound up, sealed in my students. So the image is that the students are now vehicles for the transmission of a teaching which awaits its time. Seal it up as if, and the terminology here is all legal terminology, as you would seal up a document in ancient Israel, put a seal in it, roll it up, put it in a box for preservation. Now this voice says, what I'm teaching should be rolled up, sealed, and planted in my students. That's the first usage. And then Buber says, now there are only two other times that the word appears again as a noun, and that's at the end of Isaiah. So, twice more in the book, three more times, twice in Isaiah 54, and once again in Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 54:13. So 4 times altogether. First at the beginning of the book, 3 times in the end of the book. And Buber's point is, these are supposedly 2 very different documents between the beginning and the end of the book, from 2 very different times, and modern scholarship tends to say from 2 very different perspectives, and hard to figure out why they would all be called Isaiah. Buber says, look at this. So first, Isaiah 54. So if we could look at that verse together. Adonai Elohim natan li lishon limudim, lada'at, la'utet ya'ef davar, ya'ir baboker ya'ir li ozen lishmoa kelimudim. Somebody like to read us that verse.
What verse?
Isaiah 54. Somebody like to read that verse, please. Thank you.
50 verse 4.
Chapter 50, verse 4.
The Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with the word. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught.
Yes. So that teacher and taught are the second and third use of this term in the Hebrew Bible, and as we've said, it's now traversed the beginning and the end of the book, and apparently traveled a couple of 100 years in the process. But this peculiar, distinct word remains the same. His suggestion is this, that the message filed among the original Isaiah's students in that passage in chapter 8, roll it up, seal it, and preserve it in my students, now comes to fruition in an age where this voice says, it's time to unroll it, teach it, and speak it. Somehow, as was suggested, just a moment ago, somehow a parallel transmission of the message of the prophet Isaiah has been taking place all along. Something that the book doesn't indicate. That the original Isaiah had students, that Isaiah planted certain messages for them to convey until the proper time to reveal them. And this voice, 200 years later, says, now's the time. I am one of those sealed student vessels, and now I speak the message. That the book has traveled, that is to say, the content of the book has traveled now for a couple centuries, and when it's opened within the anonymous student we meet in chapter 50, it's because that student sees in that time the moment it's to be spoken aloud. A moment when the message need no longer be sealed. And Buber goes on to say, and here's why I think this new voice thinks this is the time, which leads to the last use of the word, which is chapter 54, verse 13. So let's look at that. 54, verse 13. V'chol banayich limudei Adonai, v'rav shalom banai. So all of your children will become limudei, students or disciples of God, and then they will have great peace. Buber says the key to understanding why, in verse 50, we hear a voice saying, I'm unwrapping and unfolding a message that's been handed down for several generations, is because I sense in my generation the moment when it might bear fruit. Now, it just so happens that that moment is a time historically of extreme catastrophe. The deck's been shuffled. Everything's different from that moment 200 years earlier that the first Isaiah said, seal up my message, pass it down through my students. This new voice says, now is the time to speak such things, because for the first time in a long time, it's a very different time. The beginning of the book Isaiah is a time when the kingdom of Judah still maintains an independence. It has not yet been conquered by any of the neighboring empires, where there is a cult that still is pursued at the temple in Jerusalem, the priestly hierarchy, all of those ancient institutions that characterized central core features of biblical Israel. This new voice is almost certainly speaking in the Babylonian exile, after the destruction of the temple, the disruption of that political hierarchy, the end of Judean independence, and in the midst of this radical period of everything's changed, this voice says, and now I speak this transmitted word. And Buber says, that's why it's one book. Not because it's a single author. Not because it's a single coherent literary structure, but because it conveys something of a single message transformed and transmitted over time, and that articulates something central to the whole biblical enterprise. And that is, that's what we're doing right now. Buber says we wouldn't come back to biblical books if we didn't believe that somehow what we've just seen in the book could possibly happen here and now with us as well. That's what we look for in Isaiah. We imagine ourselves more or less as one of these living beings. And we wait to hear if in fact there's something passed down that can be unfolded within us. The only difference between what we've seen in the book and what's happening in our community in this moment is that the earliest stages of this process were preserved as an example. But now the process takes place without that kind of literary evidence. It happens among us, just as it once happened in its earliest stages in the book. Buber's suggestion is then that we understand this distinctive use of a particular Hebrew word as a key to understanding how the beginning and the end of this book, though chronologically disparate, might nevertheless properly belong together. And I think it's illuminating. If the first voice that uses this word in the book says, seal it up because now is not the time. If it reappears a couple hundred years later with someone who says, I stand in that tradition and I think now it is the time, and then Buber adds, I think this person thought it was the time because part of this person's prophecy is, we're on the verge of everyone potentially being a limud. Now I can speak it. It's not futile. I'm not beating my head against the wall. The possibility that this can prove fruitful in this particular time and place. Buber says that's what a biblical book is for. This is the paradigm in the book for how biblical books could be used ever after. In this respect, first of all, it gets us thinking, I think, in challenging ways about distinguishing between written words and the simple fact that words live only between the consciousness that forms them and the consciousness that receives them. We sometimes flatten language between the covers of a book, as if the language lives there. But language can't live in a book. It lives only in the process of communication. And so the fact that we have in the book of Isaiah communication that seems to be taking place between centuries isn't so odd if we keep in mind that that's what we're doing now, right here and now. The only difference is, as Buber suggests, this is our example of how this could happen in those earliest pages. But they're not intended to stay there. They're not intended to tell us about a one-time phenomenon. If this message from the first Isaiah could in fact survive and be transmitted for a couple hundred years and then be unrolled, as it were, in a subsequent generation, the point is that's what we do ever after. That's what written text is for. To listen and ask yourself, am I in a moment, am I in a time in which I can and should unfold these words anew? That's what words are. They're not the thing on the page, they're quanta of consciousness. And in this case, at a distance of centuries initially, but the paradigm is laid down centuries, maybe millennia. Maybe between the beginning and the end of that book. maybe between the book and here and now. But I think that observation comes with a second implication, perhaps a word of caution as well, having to do with how we read these words. Or Buber would constantly remind us how we listen to these words. It's important that we do what we can to restore to them the sense of someone speaking to you. What do you make of the speech? The limud, this student of the first part of the book of Isaiah, who heard something of himself and in his times, transmitted to another limud generations later, at a distance of 2 centuries, shared a history. It wasn't as if it was simply language alone that passed between them. They shared a history. They shared a legacy. As you suggested, they were part of a self-conscious tradition. Later parts of that tradition understood themselves, oriented themselves towards those who had passed the tradition down. Members of schools, as we sometimes say. They shared a history, shared a language, perhaps shared kinship that stretched between them. We too may hear something of our times, perhaps a bit of our name being called in ancient words. Such is their enduring power to turn us from, well, that didn't happen, to, well, that didn't happen yet. But what does it take to responsibly accept that tradition? So that's where I'd like to pause for a moment and say, there are all kinds of ways in which we can do this carelessly, in self-reverentially, ways which ignore all of the hazards that come from saying, I hear someone speaking to me across centuries, across millennia. What does it take to responsibly listen to a text in this way? What makes putting the beginning of the book of Isaiah and the end of the book of Isaiah a responsible thing to do? Or perhaps, how do you tell the difference between that didn't happen and that didn't happen yet with just plain wishful thinking? So let me ask you about that. What do you make? If Buber's right, that we have a paradigm here for listening to Scripture, the most important aspect of this disparate and confusing structure to the book of Isaiah is that it perhaps conveys the message that tradition can be transmitted from times when it's not ripe to a time when it might prove fruitful. Nevertheless, there are pitfalls and dangers with that paradigm. So, yes.
The word that keeps going through my head as you're saying all this is interpretation.
Yes.
How, I mean, somebody says this, then I have my experience now that didn't exist then.
Yes.
But the words exist then.
Yes.
But the words now say something else to me,
Yes.
and I want now to, now that's very dangerous.
It's
I mean,
dangerous, exactly. So any advice about how to negotiate those dangers? Because if Buber's correct, that that's how this book was ultimately put together, it nevertheless doesn't tell us how to negotiate the way from then to now.
But that's the job in a way, is what's the correct way to read this
Yes.
in light of this catastrophe that we might call it, that we experience today.
Yes, yes.
So, does he have an insight?
Well, that's my question. Do you have any sage advice for how to do that? How do we do that well? Or how can you inform it? How can it be, yes, please?
I'm asking a side question. I want you to correct me if I'm wrong in what I have observed. In a Jewish-Christian dialogue setting,
Yes.
it was said by a Jewish person, we hardly know Isaiah. You want to talk to us about Isaiah in relationship to Jesus, but we are prepared to talk with you about that, not only because we're not considering Jesus so much, but because we have our Torah, and the Torah gets all of our attention. And the other books of the Hebrew Bible are sort of in the background, and the ordinary people in a Jewish temple would not even wouldn't know anything about Isaiah. So is that correct in your understanding? And what authority does the book of Isaiah and this tradition you're talking about, is that happening in the Jewish community?
That's a wonderful question. I'd start with this. The origin of the forms of Jewish life that have proved most durable from roughly the 1st century to the 20th all involved a certain degree of keeping one's distance from the prophetic tradition. And that because the historical experience of the Jewish people in the 1st and 2nd centuries repeatedly suggested that playing with the prophets was playing with fire, and that the survival of Jewish life depended on a modicum of normalcy. And that normalcy comes to be embodied in Jewish legal tradition. We group law and prophets easily as a single body. But in Jewish sources, for the most part, prophets inspire, but the law teaches. And so what you heard, I think, if I could be fair to the other person, in that exchange was, we read a passage from one of the prophetic books every Sabbath morning in synagogue. We understand it as the necessary coefficient of Jewish legal tradition. And nevertheless, we are cautious about presuming that that spontaneous and unpredictable prophetic moment still pertains to our circumstances.
Thank you very much. I
That
have to
makes
go.
sense? Yeah, thank you for the question. That's just a way of saying that if I asked a moment ago, how do you read what we've just suggested with due caution? In Jewish tradition, that due caution has become great caution. Yes, please.
When I was in seminary, there was a class that you had to pass, and lots of my colleagues ended up taking the class more than once because they didn't, because it was tough.
Yes.
And it was called hermeneutics.
Yes.
And the point of it was, how does a preacher go from a particular text to proclaiming something that has the same effect
Yes.
on the modern hearer that that text would have done,
Yes.
without sort of pretending that it can be just automatically translated.
Yes.
But one of the great concerns was the hermeneutical filters that we bring. And
Yes.
so you do the language study, you
Yes.
do the sociocultural study to figure out what was going on with this thing.
Yes.
You figure out how it fit within the framework of what seems to be the book.
Yes.
And then you try to figure out what's the intersection then with modern conditions, modern issues and problems. But it was devilishly difficult to do.
Yes.
To make something from 2,000 years ago
Yes.
seem relevant without either trivializing it or simply, just say, well, what was concern for them is our concern today, whether we know it or not. So,
Yes. And often, the upshot of the kind of hermeneutics you've described in seminaries was a whole lot more like an autopsy. When you were done with it, you had a bunch of organs on the table, but it didn't live anymore.
The goal was to let the bones live again. It was really the sermon, because that's where it was going.
So let me turn the question around, Mike, and ask it this way. It looks like what Buber is suggesting is that part of what we have to keep in mind about what the book of Isaiah suggests was an ancient Jewish understanding of what properly belongs together and could all be called Isaiah is a teaching that awaits its moment. That if you have a teaching in a tradition that still is in the state of not yet, it's appropriate to call that part of this larger body, which is a better name than book for what we have in Isaiah. When was the last time you can remember the book of Isaiah, or any biblical book, finding exactly the right time for an American audience? When was the last time you heard someone say, here's a prophetic passage, and the not yet is now? Who was it who did it?
Martin Luther King.
Yes, absolutely. It was Martin Luther King, of course. It was Martin Luther King's great biblical gift to do exactly what the book of Isaiah, Buber says, is describing. It's just that Martin Luther King, at a distance of a couple thousand years, doesn't make it into the text, but he's part of the same process. Not yet becomes now. Well, let me close with this and say, at the very least, this problem of hermeneutics, if it's to live, especially in a prophetic tradition, has to give ample room for something a little more than what goes on in the head. That one has to accurately read one's circumstance, read one's moment, and say, in this moment, what do I now hear from those words? But it behooves us to listen carefully, casually, carelessly, not recklessly, but carefully. Nevertheless, I think that expectation is what brings us back to Scripture again and again. The book of Isaiah at the very least, or the book of Isaiah's, can be our model and our teacher in that regard. Next week, as I said, I'd like to take a look at a specific passage from Isaiah, one that I think many of us are familiar with, one which is profoundly inspiring, one which I think will challenge our ability to say, not yet, but maybe now. Let's see if we can put together this initial conversation with that particular passage.